Thank you, Anne-Garland, very much, and thank you, university and department staff, for making this happen. This is a really important body of work, and I want to share as much as I can. So thank you all for coming. I wish there's some seats up in front if people want to sit. So what I'm going to talk about is both Cuban poster art and poster art in general, because I was just giving a little bit of a presentation earlier to your fine printmaking department, and printmaking is a really underappreciated craft, and especially when it's applied in the service of social change. So what we're looking at is, in my opinion, one of the most vital fluorescents of the relationship between printmaking and social change. Sometimes the word revolution is thrown in there, but once you have a revolution, you still need to make social change and continue to improve your society and make things better. So what we're going to see is a very broad concept of what constitutes a communist poster. So let's just jump into this. This is somewhat informal. I know I'm wearing a tie, but if somebody has a burning question, please raise it. We want to hear these questions. This is a community process. Here's a great phrase describing the role of posters. This was from the Spanish Civil War. Soldiers of paper and ink alongside those of flesh and blood. Another term that I've heard used is paper bullets. Posters are really valuable tools for expressing messages, and especially if you're trying to reach certain constituencies. And so what we're going to see here are some examples of how that's done. We've got a small country. We've got a country of 10 million people and a relatively literate country. And so posters in a society like that were very functional, but posters have been very functional in other societies as well, including our own. I mean, in the United States, during the 30s, during the federal art programs, it was the first time that many Americans had held an original piece of art, and it was a screen-printed or a linoleum-cut piece made at their local workshop. So it's an art form that sometimes is art and sometimes is not considered art. I consider it essential no matter what. These are several of the artists that I met when I was visiting in Cuba and talking to them. I didn't start out by wanting to be an archivist of Cuban posters. I went there and I realized that there was a giant void in the scholarship. In graphic art, there's a concept of positive and negative space, sort of the relationship between what's there and what's not. And when I went there on a trip to the Biennale, to the art exhibition, I realized there's a lot of scholarship about this subject that was lacking. So I rolled up my sleeves and started to document it, and I realized that there was a lot more to it than that. That propelled me into a whole second career as an archivist. And the reason I'm an archivist is so that I can get my hands on the raw materials before the scholars do. So if you ever want to consider a career, I'll talk you into being an archivist. But these people are some of the most wonderful people you'll ever meet. They were just fantastic folks. One thing to think about when you think of a country like Cuba and the relationship of visual propaganda is the lack of commercial propaganda. We don't have ads for Toyota. We don't have ads for Coca-Cola. We don't have McDonald's signs. We have community billboards, and that's it. So the scope of what these do has a very different impact than it does if you were to put something up in the middle of Main Street. So these posters and these billboards all have a much greater impact than they would under other circumstances. This is a backlit. There's 4 signs in a quad right there. This is Jose Marti. So people think of communist posters and they go, oh, grim, workers, horrible stuff. Well, I think that's not even true, and I think it's not even true of posters from the Chinese Cultural Revolution. This is actually very fine art, in my opinion. Most of the Chinese posters started off as paintings and then were turned into posters through the lithographic process. These slogans are a little bit stiff. Expedite the pace of agricultural mechanization. Strive for agricultural modernization. It's a good idea, but a little stiff. But the Cubans were not the Chinese. The Cubans were not the Soviets. The Cubans are the Cubans. And they instilled a particular combination of their own style with a common framework to come up with a rare and unique body of work. So let's look at some of the agencies that produce these, because we're not talking about community-based posters. In the United States, a lot of the work I work with is with posters that are made by small organizations and individuals. In Cuba, the body of work that we're looking at here were all produced by various governmental and government-related organizations. So they are basically their version of a public service message. And so some of the agencies include Editora Politica, which is the publishing arm of the Cuban Communist Party, ICAIC, which is the Cuban Film Agency, and then OSPAL, it's technically not a Cuban organization, it's a non-governmental organization, it's housed in Cuba, but people think of it as Cuban. And so we're going to look at some of those in more detail. So Editora Politica, you think, oh, the publishing arm of the Cuban Communist Party, they've got to have a big swanky office. And no, this is Cuba, this is Havana. Some of the lights didn't work. It's humble. It's not ostentatious. So, this is their logo. This is their little office. And so I worked with them, and I worked with their archives, and slowly extracted copies of stuff. Sometimes the copies were slides. Some of the images that you see on the walls here, I've never seen the original poster, but I did have a bad slide that I cleaned up. So, here we have this one here. It just happened to be number 1. How convenient. You look at the colors on this stuff. This is not colors that the Chinese would use, or the Soviets would use, or the Yugoslavs. This is Cuban. This is like rich, vibrant, sort of tropical colors. You don't see orange horses, and it's just what they do is they instill their own approach to this stuff. This is, you've got 2 revolutionary heroes, but you're treating it artistically in a very unorthodox way. This is René Medeiros, who was just a wonderful friend of mine. He designed this billboard. Again, we've seen some of the billboards. This is in honor of the October Revolution in Russia. These are made in these giant sheets of screen-printed paper that were pasted up on a billboard. So these are 12 sheets. It's a 12-sheet billboard. I have a little section of this right there at home. It's this big. But it just shows some of the style, but also, during a certain period in Cuba, and which sort of has continued to this day, there's not a lot of resources. It's not a rich country. And so there's a lot of white space. You don't use a lot of ink when you've got the white space in the background. But the country takes this stuff seriously at all levels. Visual propaganda, and I use that word non-pejoratively. Propaganda is simply trying to communicate a point of view. You like it, you don't like it, but we use propaganda, we call it advertising. But this is propaganda, but it's propaganda that was done by René Medeiros. This is a postage stamp made from a poster that he had done. He visited Vietnam twice during the war. I say the Vietnam War. And he represented the war from the Vietnamese point of view. And so you see these peasants going about their daily lives prepared for war. This was one of the themes that you see is, here's a country just trying to go about its business and is struggling against first French and then American imperialism. So beautiful art, wonderfully rendered, and then turned into a postage stamp for the nation. This is a high honor for a piece of art. You start to see agencies that cross a lot of boundaries, and so you start to do, if you imagine there's one agency in this country that would be responsible for all its propaganda, you start to see some potential conflict. So here we have, one of the main crops of Cuba, tobacco. Tobacco awaits your youthful hand. They had these youthful harvest brigades during the summers when students weren't in school. They would go help with the tobacco. Well, you also have a poster about, are you at risk? You can get these diseases from smoking tobacco. So these are both legitimate public service messages, and they happen to have this artistic similarity. You get playful stuff. You get peace with a broken arrow. You get peace with a careful, be caution. This is peace. We can't bomb it or break it. You don't always need words for posters, and the Cubans were very good at being very spare with their words. You don't see expedite agricultural mechanization, but you did in the early part. They weren't always great posters. After the Revolution, Cuban posters were as boring and as stiff and as unartistic as you would expect from sort of communist propaganda. And so you look at this poster and you've got there's a little bit of cleverness. There's a blindfolded American eagle, disorient the enemy. But it's a pretty boring poster. It's very hard to read. It's not artistic. But what happened? What started to turn this around? And as we'll see, it was culture that led the way for politics. It was the Film Institute that said, we're going to start doing posters on our own. And they did incredible posters. And then the political people said, wow, that's pretty neat. Let's start doing that. It was the same thing that happened in the United States. If you realize between 1945 and 1965, you could mount an exhibition of political posters made in this country in this room. People did not make political posters in this country because of anti-communism and McCarthyism. It was dangerous to make posters. And so you look around, and there weren't very many posters made. The free speech movement, one of the landmarks of sort of the struggle, had no posters. Song, dance, theater, there wasn't a single poster made for the free speech movement. What changed that was Bill Graham rock posters in 1965 saying, hey, let's reintroduce posters into the mainstream as a popular thing. People loved them, and the political people jumped on board. Same thing happened in Cuba. Welcome to Arafat. You get history reflected in these posters, moments that happened that may not be reflected anywhere else. Here's a May Day poster. Well, you don't have burly workers, driving tractors. You've got the family goes to May Day. I mean, the integration of politics and culture in Cuba is really different, and it's counterintuitive to what we've been told about Cuba. Here's another one about May Day, and it does have workers' tools. This is from the Confederation of Spanish Workers. You've got sort of playful color in this, colorized photograph. So let's talk about Akai, because they really broke the mold. And this was really pretty interesting, because they were, there was this mandate to start producing things that were representative of what the revolution was. Well, one really important tool for that is documentary films. And the Cubans went whole hog into this, and they said, we're going to take this very seriously. So they started making their own documentary films, but they showed these around, and they even did mobile films. They would have brigades that would go out into the countryside, because Cuba was still very rural, and still is. I mean, only 1 million people live in Havana out of 10 million people. So films were a big deal, and films were very popular. Everybody likes to go see films. And so they were making a lot of films, but they said, well, we got to publicize these films, so they would make posters for the films. And they would also make posters for films that weren't Cuban. A Soviet film would be shown, an American film would be shown. They would make a Cuban version of a poster about that film. So you start to see interesting things. You see posters that aren't about the stars. They're about the concept of the film. So you have an artistic treatment about another medium, which is a film. This is a beautiful treatment of how do you represent sort of the defeat of a monarchy. Well, you have a crown, and you have things growing out of it. And not just things, but you have colorful flowers. I mean, they really were very good at a very spare, very elegant, very concise treatment for getting a message across, which is really hard when you're challenging some of these subjects. Beautiful stuff. You have little motion going on within posters. You start to even see storylines. This one here, well, you realize up at the top, it's not just a background, there's a little storyboard going on. So you've got a bunch of slaves with sticks all chained together, and then the chain's broken, and then the stick turns into a gun. So you go from this transition from colonial oppression to liberation in one poster. I mean, it's really elegant, and you obviously have, in the foreground, which one you want to pay attention to, but in the background is the little sub-story. This one of Pinochet with a guitar smashed onto his nose. The force of culture as a way of resisting oppression of various forms. OSPAL, which is the Organization in Solidarity with the People of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Anne-Garland just went there and visited there. As I said, it's technically a non-governmental organization that happens to be housed in Cuba. They were doing incredible stuff. They were founded in '66. They were at the tail end of an earlier predecessor organization that didn't include Latin America, and finally Latin America was included. They published a magazine called Tricontinental, which was mailed out all over the world. And because it was an international publication, there were things in multiple languages. So you'll see that the posters also had very short slogans, but in multiple languages. 30,000 people in '89, not bad. So you start to see these, wonderful artistic treatments of various subjects. Che, this blow up of the continent of South America with, exploding frames around Che Guevara. You get a mixture of imagery. You get indigenous imagery. This is traditional sort of Central American imagery with an AK-47. And so you start to realize, well, there's a whole layering of the iconography. Well, if you're showing an aircraft carrier, you're showing a fighter jet, you're not showing resistance from indigenous people. You're showing, American imperialism. If you're showing an AK-47 or you're showing, a sword, you're showing the resistance of people on the ground. So the weapons that are represented have a whole background as to themselves. You know what's being shown by those particular weapons. Also, just treatment of stuff just as abstract. I mean, this one from Venezuela, a wild graphic image. I mean, remarkably powerful stuff. So I saw this poster among the Ospal collection and go, wow, that doesn't look like a Cuban poster. And I was talking to some of the Cuban graphic artists. They laughed. They said, the Korean delegation came and said, we want you to do a poster. We want Ospal to do a poster about sort of U.S. out of Korea. And we did a poster, and they didn't like it. And we did another poster, and they didn't like it either. So we said, fine, do your own poster. They did this poster. So this was done by a Korean graphic artist. This is what the Cubans do. This is a whole different treatment of the same subject, where you've got the Korean flag at the top, and you've got this incredible, talk about positive and negative space. You've got this American eagle dropping from the sky, pierced by red things, and you know it's an American eagle because it's got, the sign on. I mean, this is a totally different treatment than what the Koreans did. I mean, the graphic brilliance in this stuff is staggering. So let's talk about some of the subjects, because these are the agencies that produce the stuff. But then they did a wide range of material. So I love this quote from Jose Marti, because the idea is, national pride. I mean, the Cuban Revolution was not a revolution for communism or a revolution for socialism. It was a revolution to get sort of foreign domination, either directly or indirectly, out of the country. So Batista, who was heavily supported by the U.S., was a horrible dictator. And even the U.S. was sort of saying, this guy's not going to last. And he got kicked out. And so in 1959, Cuba got to start over again. But I'm not going to go into a long dialogue about the Spanish-American War and how we jumped in on it. It was a total target of opportunity for the United States. It was not one of our most glamorous wars. And if you believe there ever was a glamorous war, this wasn't it. So military history, the Spanish-American War was bad, and that's why we have the Guantanamo Naval Base. It was a coaling station for ships. We kept that. So national pride was the driving force behind the Cuban Revolution. So you start to see all this stuff about how we can do it ourselves. We've got sugar, we've got tobacco, we've got people power. Let's make this work. So here's a clever. This is a 25 years of agrarian reform. But it's a tractor. So again, playing with visual imagery. Now this is one of my favorites. This is by René Medeiros, and it says, "As in Vietnam." And the whole idea is you've got this Cuban peasant. He's in black and white. He's not, he's part of the picture, but he's not the picture. He's in black and white cutting sugar cane, and his thought balloon is of his sister halfway across the world, going about her business, harvesting rice. She's got a weapon because she's at war. And so this is the international solidarity among peasants. Just, remarkable treatment. Again, just the use of color, black and white and color. How do you put this together? Very beautifully done. Sugarcane is not black and green. I mean, you play with the colors. You make it visually stimulating because you want this to work as art. This one here about, growing all sorts of other crops. We're not just growing tobacco. We're not just growing sugar. We're growing all sorts of things people need to eat. Backyard gardens. This is like victory gardens during the war. We encourage people to grow various crops. God knows what some of these things are. I mean, yeah, potatoes, but I don't know. But it's crops. They're tropical crops, and you can grow them. This one's really beautiful. So you're talking about the safra, which is the sugar harvest. And so you combine a bunch of things. You've got these striations that come down. They're sort of like sugar cane. You've got the, irrepressible cane cutting of, the cane. And then you've got the gears of the machinery that chews up the cane and turns it into sugar. So you combine visually all these different aspects of sugar production. The machete is in the middle. Here we are, youth harvesting tobacco, but you've got the school. So you combine these two sorts of images together. So you've got tobacco, sugar cane on the right, and books in the middle. So again, youth harvesting, youth contributing to the general economic goodwill, but how do you treat that visually? Here you've got something, oh my gosh, foreign penetration of the universities, changing what the schools are teaching. I mean, this is a big deal in Latin America and some might say in other parts of the world. So here you have, yes, this grateful grad, and then you've got money here. So this is against imperialist penetration in universities. Again, how do you communicate difficult, abstract concepts? I'm going to study to be a teacher. I mean, it's a sweet concept. And thank you, teachers here. All the teachers here deserve a round of applause. This one's here, motorized health brigades. I happen to like to ride a motorcycle, and this is a beautiful treatment of part of a motorcycle image. These are brigades that would go out and do first aid out in the countryside. This is like the barefoot doctors in China. When you've got a rural economy and you don't have a lot of money, how do you make healthcare work? Public healthcare relies on people power and it relies on mobility. So that's what these people are doing. This one here, I'm a real fan of posters about occupational health. It's not a very sexy topic, but you take this graphic image of be careful, don't cut yourself with a knife. Well, that's a sort of grisly subject. You might show somebody with a broken finger, cut. Well, no, this is treating it as art. And so again, very, very brilliant graphic treatment here. Only use what's necessary. This is saving electricity. The only room that's lit up in this entire house is one room, and that person's reading. So you're encouraging multiple levels of civic responsibility. Recycle bottles. This could be a poster in Berkeley. This is, we need to be careful about our own resources. These are communist propaganda posters, by the way, published by the Cuban Communist Party. Social equality. Yeah. Women. International Women's Day. We don't seem to celebrate International Women's Day here very much, but in Cuba it's a big deal. And you've got women in different capacities, including being women at home care. You get Barbie, revolutionary Barbie here, but International Women's Day. But this was we're talking 68 here. Things were different in 68. Flowers in her hair, and she's part of the revolution. This is an important poster because there's not a lot of posters in Cuba about their slave history, and this was one of the few that I ran across. And again, it proudly proclaims that the slaves were the early part of our social revolution. That's a pretty bold thing to say. That's like saying that slaves in America were part of our economic stability and power. We don't hear that a whole lot, but they were. So posters like this were really important. You start to get things like sports. Boxing, wrestling, baseball. And they're not about individuals. It's not about, this particular batter. It's about team. It's about, being healthy. Solidarity. Again, in Cuba, solidarity was a really big deal, and they took it very, very seriously because they were a small country, but they had kicked out a dictator. They had won over American imperialism. They were a shining beacon among many countries in the world, developing countries, third world countries, socialist countries. And so their acts of solidarity were very, very important, and they exercised that in many capacities, including, Cuba right now has sent out medical aid to help with Ebola. Cuba continues to export social good. So here's some examples of how do you talk about, there's military support. Cuba sent soldiers to help fight with South Africa, with Angola. But talk about difficult concepts. How do you do a poster about anti-colonialism or anti-capitalism? Well, these are really simple examples that are very clear. You've got a colonial pith helmet penetrated by an indigenous arrow. Message has gotten across. You've got, Vitruvian man chained by capitalism. So you start to, there's different ways of interpreting, but you want to get these messages across. And again, you see the multiple languages. Who remembers that U.S. invaded Santo Domingo in 1965? So here's an example. Now this poster, here's an example where the Cubans did a lot of this stuff without a lot of money or a lot of resources. The way that they made that splatter pattern, in America they would have used an airbrush. In Cuba, they put some ink on top of a toothbrush and went, okay? That's how the artist told me he made that piece of art. So you don't need fancy, expensive computers and tools to make very powerful art. Patrice Lumumba. This was one of the first posters I ever saw from OSPAL. And again, you start to show how do you communicate a range of concepts. You've got this woven basket, which is vaguely reminiscent of a hat, but it's also a basket. It's made up of the words in various languages that together, no single strand works. All together have to form this basket, this net that is stopping this bomb. They don't have to say an American bomb, because we all know whose bombs were dropping on Vietnam, and the unified North and South Vietnam. The only words there are solidarity, but we know exactly what it's about. Very elegant, very simple. This poster was done by a North American artist, Jane Norling, who was very involved in Cuba Solidarity. She went to OSPAL for a couple of months, and she was working there as a graphic artist. And here's where you start to get these counterintuitive stories. She said, "Oh, I'm ready." I said, "Well, why don't you put your name on it?" She said, "Oh, we're not used to putting our name on things in America. That's considered bourgeois." Well, the Cubans said, "Oh, we think it's fine. You put your name on it because you made it. We all know that you're not doing it to take personal glory out of this. It's credit. And artists deserve credit." And so she put her name on it. She was shocked that the Cubans wanted her to put her name on it. Because in this country, in the 60s and 70s, a lot of stuff is uncredited. It was considered bourgeois. You were part of a collective. You didn't put your name on it. And only now are we finally going back in and going, who made this poster, and discovering that stuff. Jane continues to this day to make art that is very similar in style. This is sort of less typical. This is more typical of something you'd see out of maybe Chile or Mexico. But again, you start to see these international conferences. Okay, so international residents. Let's move on to the concept of what do these posters mean? I mean, these were mostly for domestic consumption, except for the OSPAL posters, which went internationally. But one of the things about posters like this is you can't hold them down. They really have an impact among other graphic artists. I mean, when I saw a poster I thought, this is a brilliant poster. I want to do something that good. So they were inspiring politically and artistically. And consequently, they really sort of had an impact all over the world. People looked to these for inspiration. I worked on a couple of exhibitions that specifically explored this interrelationship. Here's one that I just did last year in San Francisco at the Museum of the African Diaspora. And there's no question that, the Black Power movement in the United States, which was also tied to the Black liberation movements in Africa, had a very close link with Cuban art and Cuban political solidarity. So I was showing some of those examples of how that worked. Here's an example. This is an OSPAL poster, Solidarity with Angola. This poster was republished in the United States. You may not be able to see it way down here. There's a union label for Glad Day Press, which was in Ithaca, New York. It was one of the first independent movement presses, and they republished it as an act of solidarity to help the Cubans out. They added some color, they put their own bug on it, and they distributed these within the United States. So these were sold in bookstores, and they were distributed for free. So again, they took that poster immediately, they mimicked it and distributed it. This poster, which René Medeiros did, is one of his series from Vietnam. This was reissued as a poster in the United States to raise money for medical aid to Indochina. This was people that were sending doctors and medical supplies to Vietnam to sort of counteract the role of the war and Agent Orange and the bombing and so forth. So this poster, you will see posters like this that at the very bottom imprinted, say, medical aid for Indochina and a fundraiser and where to send your money. So again, these posters were reinterpreted and reused in this country for a very productive means. Here's a poster that Daysi Garcia, one of the women graphic artists in Cuba, did, 1968. It's Day of Solidarity with the Afro-American People. Okay? August 18th was when George Jackson was assassinated. Well, then you see this other poster that was reissued. This was done by the Venceremos Brigade, which was one of the main organizations that sent U.S. people and Canadians to Cuba sort of to do work, but also to do an exchange around ideas and to raise the profile of the Cuban Revolution. The title is different. Solidarity with the African people. So they changed the slogan a little bit. They made it a slightly different concept of a poster, but it's the same graphic image. A black nationalist organization in the United States took the same image, they reinterpreted it, and made it their own. So you start to see how images just have a life of their own. They just keep moving along. Emory Douglas perhaps the most prolific and well-known graphic artist of the Black Panther Party. He did this poster in '67, and yes, it's unnerving to see a child with a pistol, but something I have to keep explaining all the time is if you go back to that time, there really was police repression of the black community, and self-defense was considered a necessary step in the preservation of the black movement. And so it's, from this distance in time, that looks scary. But that was what was going on. Well, you see here this Cuban interpretation of it. They changed it a little bit. They added color, but it was clearly derived from him. They didn't credit Emory Douglas. Emory Douglas didn't care. That was fine. Back in the day, as long as it was within the revolution and supporting a worthy goal, the notion of artistic credit sort of fell by the wayside, and it wasn't a big deal. Now we start to see you think, oh God, all this stuff was done in the 60s and 70s. We sort of know everything there is to know about it. As I explained to Anne, we're still learning new stuff. And part of the reason we're learning new stuff is because new forms of scholarship are possible. And new forms of scholarship are possible because of digital media. The fact that I've digitized large swaths of these posters, and then I can say, well, have you seen this poster? People do articles, and they start to have more images in there. This was a poster that was done in '68, by Alfredo Roscard, one of the people I showed you a slide of in the first part. Black Power. Well, then we saw this, and I saw this in a catalog, and it was described as a poster, and I thought, wow, I've never seen that poster. But then I sort of looked at it more carefully, and I looked carefully at the catalog record, and it described it as being 3 by 5 inches. Well, that's not a poster, that's a postcard. So I started to figure out, well, where did that come from? So I engaged in a 3-way conversation between 2 other scholars that were also poking at this problem from different directions. So this is the famous poster, for those of you that are old, of Huey Newton in a wicker chair, and this was one of the most famous posters of the Black Panther Party. And so this image was dropped in on top of this. Well, it turns out there was the Cubans that did this in this postcard. This was published by OSPAL, this postcard. There's a whole diatribe about sort of freeing the Black Panthers and getting Panthers out of jail, murdering Black Panthers. Well, then right away, the Black Panther Party newspaper published this in their newsletter, the magazine, The Black Panther. Verbatim text. They took the text from Cuba, so they didn't credit Cuba for this. So lack of credit was going both ways, but it didn't matter. It was all okay. So they reprinted the postcard and the text. So this is the kind of stuff where this field has not been picked over. There's still a lot to do. Anybody who wants to do a dissertation, talk to me. I'll give you 4 ideas. There's plenty of stuff to do. It's amazing. But then the influences continue. This is part of the exhibition I do at the Berkeley Art Center, where I show contemporary Bay Area artists whose work was inspired by the work coming out of Cuba. This is Rupert Garcia, really fantastic, prolific Chicano artist. You can really see the style of Hernán in this very stylized, colorized version of stuff. Juan Fuentes, same thing. You can really see, but you're bringing it up to the present. These are posters that are much more contemporary, 2002. Malaquias Montoya, one of the deans of Chicano poster making. He's visited Cuba several times. Again, he relies on iconography. Different kinds of hats. You've got a beret, you've got a sombrero, you've got a Nicaraguan flag, you've got a Cuban flag. So hints of iconography are all you need. So you don't want to beat somebody over the head. Art should get people to think. It shouldn't just beat them over the head. And I think the Cubans have shown that they can do that in spades. Radio Bilingüe, in this style. This is for a bilingual radio station in Fresno. Same style. Jane Norley, the woman I was telling you about who did the poster that she put the credit on. Well, she's doing campaign posters for progressive campaigns in the Bay Area. If I had changed this into Spanish, I could have told you this was a poster done in Cuba. She did this. She does this now. This is what she does for a living. But a lot of what she learned in the spirit of what was coming out of Cuba. And further image recycling in less positive ways. So this poster, which is here, is one of my favorite presidents, Richard Nixon, with bodies of dead peasants. Well, here's a poster. Here's some versions that were done. This is bringing it close. This is El Grito. This is from New Mexico. They used that image. Here's one from Ireland, talking about U.S. military out of Ireland. Same concept. You see a good graphic treatment has legs, and it gets picked up again and again and again. Here's this one I showed you from an image. Well, I was walking down the street one day in Berkeley, and I saw somebody selling T-shirts. I said, do you know where that image comes from? I said, I have no idea. But I explained to him the whole story, and you can barely see the bottom of the thought balloon right here. He didn't even crop that out. He didn't, so he just cropped it, did it. And so I knew exactly what it was. So I keep seeing images that are recycled in various ways, and it's a teaching opportunity. It's a way to get people to understand. I don't know if we have this one here or not, probably not. But this got picked up in Canada. This was picked up by the Revolutionary Communist Party. They put their own words in it. So some of these are sloppier reinterpretations than others, but a powerful graphic image is a powerful graphic image. Now, Shepard Fairey, I've been mentioning Shepard Fairey. You look at the posters that he's done, and then you look at the posters that he's ripped off from Cuba. So I locked horns with Shepard, and especially since he does a lot of his distribution is through a Canadian agency, and Canada has relations with Cuba, even though we don't. They were very sensitive to this stuff. I said, Shepard, you can't just rip this stuff off. And so I got him to pay some sort of a royalty to the family of Renee-Medeiros' estate. I mean, this one especially, it's just a direct ripoff. You change the color. Wow, that's art? No, that's a ripoff. So he backed off. He did the right thing. But this raises the whole concept of, how do you use these things in a respectful way? And there are ways to do it. And hopefully I've been educating Shepard Fairey about this. So that's me. That's the USS Iowa, too big to enter Cuban harbor, 48-star flag. That's my brother at the bottom. That car is still there. And that's the end of my talk. And I'm hoping for questions here.